Money plus violence equals capitalism. Wow, right? That is a remarkably punchy statement from the German economist and sociologist Werner Sombart. And honestly, it's the absolute perfect hook for today's explainer. We're going to be looking at a fascinating, frankly wild period of history where the circulation of massive amounts of money started leaving fewer and fewer traces, and in the process, fundamentally reshaped European society from the ground up. Sombart argued that without the violence and corruption that was totally intrinsic to colonial exploitation, modern capitalism as we know it would hardly even be possible. It's a really bold claim, for sure, and it sets the stage perfectly for what we're about to uncover. Welcome to today's explainer. We're diving into this massive, globe-spanning shift that played out across the 19th century. We're going to see how global banking didn't just casually support nations, but became so inextricably tied up with state survival that you couldn't separate the two. We'll explore how this messy intertwining of money and power set off a massive domino effect. Literally a sprawling chain reaction of corruption, aggressive imperial expansion, and deep political decay that started right after Waterloo and marched us straight into the trenches of World War I. All right, so let's start by doing what you always do to find the truth. Follow the money. And in the 19th century, following the money usually meant knocking on the door of the House of Rothschild. It's pretty well known that the Duke of Wellington could literally never have paid his army at Waterloo without Nathan Rothschild's wallet. But what happens after the smoke clears and the battle is won? Well, Rothschild simply turns around and wins the incredibly lucrative contract to manage the payment of tributes to the European allies. As the sheer volume of wealth grew, the power of banking started to literally redraw the map of Europe. Take Italy, for example. The Count of Cavour was busy planning the Second War of Independence against Austria. To pull it off, he obviously needed serious capital. So he goes to the House of Rothschild and secures the funds using a brilliant, if entirely fabricated, excuse. He claimed he was going to use the cash to build the Mont Cenis Pass Railway. Just like that, the Rothschild Bank became the absolute financial engine behind European statecraft and warfare. But here's the catch. When a state's ambitions are fueled by this kind of limitless, globalized capital, those ambitions inevitably outgrow their own borders. This hunger for capital fundamentally drove nations toward aggressive, ruthless imperialist expansion. Winston Churchill supposedly offered this cynical yet highly accurate take on the Tory party of the era, calling it corruption at home, aggression abroad to cover it up. It really hits the nail on the head and highlights a profound historical truth. To distract everyone from the rot happening on the inside, nations almost always turn to conquest on the outside. So how did this export of empire actually play out? Well, they had a very specific playbook. Step one was all about PR, establishing a narrative. The intense economic exploitation of the Americas, Asia, and Africa was heavily bolstered by racial and religious theories. Statesmen suddenly claimed a moral obligation to rule and Christianize populations they deemed uncivilized. It was spun as this grand civilizing mission. Step two was making it all legal on paper. This culminated in the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference, where European powers literally sat around a table and formally sanctioned the divvying up of the rest of the world like it was a pie. And step three? That was the devastating reality on the ground. The unleashing of systematic, brutal economic exploitation that radically disrupted indigenous social structures, customs, and millions of lives. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to ground the violence of imperialism in specific characters. We aren't just talking about faceless, abstract states. We're talking about individuals who looked at the globe and saw a private piggy bank. A chilling example is King Leopold II of Belgium. He treated the Congo Free State not as a national colony, but as his own completely private business venture, which led to the radical, horrific exploitation of human labor and natural resources. And then you have guys like Cecil Rhodes, who essentially plundered a vast portion of Africa for the British Empire. Rhodes operated on a remarkably dark, unscrupulous motto, every man has his price. When you have distant central powers trying to control faraway lands, it just creates this incredibly fertile terrain for a whole ecosystem of corrupt functionaries. Their silence and complicity, just another line item on the budget. Now, let's zoom back to Europe for a second, because remember Churchill's quote, corruption at home? The states sending these plunderers abroad were deeply, fundamentally compromised themselves. Look at newly unified Italy. A politician named Agostino de Preti's inaugurated a political system known as trasformismo. This was essentially a system built on a continuous game of political musical chairs, the systematic changing of the guard of majorities. Instead of taking principled stands, politicians constantly shifted alliances just to stay in power. This kind of political shapeshifting rapidly facilitated absolutely pervasive government corruption. The so-called fathers of the homeland were painted by official rhetoric as purely virtuous heroes. But underneath it all, the system was just a massive conspiracy of frauds. If you really want to grasp the environment of the late 19th century, just look at how fast these scandals piled up. It wasn't just one isolated bad apple. It was a relentless barrage of systemic crises happening one after another across Europe. In 1862, the Southern Italian railways are shadily sold off. In 1868, the state tobacco monopoly is mysteriously subcontracted. Jump to 1889, and the massive Panama Canal scandal erupts in France. By 1893, Italy is rocked yet again by the Banca Romana criminal trial. It was just one thing after another, showing how completely endemic this malfeasance really was. Let's put some numbers to this so we can really understand the scale. 4 million. That is the number of francs, and we're talking 19th century currency here, which is a fortune that Ferdinand de Lesseps just handed out in bribes during the Panama Canal scandal in France. De Lesseps, who was hailed as the hero of the Suez Canal, used this massive slush fund to buy off the press and politicians to pass favorable laws for his new venture. When his company inevitably went bankrupt, thousands of everyday small investors were completely ruined. But the true culprits, they had powerful political protection and basically walked away scot-free. Okay, how about 50 million? Back in Italy, during a really tough economic period, the prime minister was desperately trying to reduce public debt. So he subcontracts the state tobacco monopoly to a private company. The deal was supposed to pay the state 180 million lira. However, it's pretty much a historical certainty that at least 50 million of that vanished straight into private pockets. And the cover-up? It was violently defended. A parliamentarian named Cristiano Lambia, who was loudly calling out this tobacco scandal, was literally clubbed and stabbed in the streets of Florence. He actually survived. And the wildest part? His hat got dented in the attack, and some enterprising hat maker started selling a new style with a crease in the crown called the Lambia. So the guy goes down in history for a fashion trend, while the actual bribery and corruption went entirely unpunished. You literally can't make this stuff up. And then we hit the climax of this era of financial political rot. 1 million. During the Banca Roma scandal, an unscrupulous profiteer named Bernardo Tanlongo was just casually issuing bills of exchange and throwing bribes at politicians. The Prime Minister of Italy himself, Francesco Crispi, took payments that would equal roughly 1 million modern euros today. Crispi then tried to use his powerful position to bring down a political rival, Giovanni Giolitti. But Giolitti wasn't playing around. He didn't hesitate to publicly reveal the truth about Crispi's exorbitant payoffs. The whole thing was a total mess. So what does all of this mean for the society of the time? Well, Francesco de Sanctis, an Italian parliament member and literary figure, made a brilliant distinction that captures this cultural shift perfectly. He asked people to compare the idea of corruttela with corruzione. Corruttela is sort of a medicine. It's like a general vibe of depravity, a mood where people just shrug and accept that fraud is inevitable. But what Europe was actually shifting into was corruzione. This was the concrete, direct, mechanical act of systemic political bribery. It wasn't just a cultural bad mood anymore. It had literally become the operational business model for the state. You know, the great writers of the time were watching all of this happen in real time, and they acted like a cultural mirror, documenting the decay. In his novel Nostromo, the Polish-American writer Joseph Conrad created this fictional Latin American country of Costaguana just to write about a corruption so universal, so deep, that it almost lost its meaning. His character Charles Gould justifies endless money-making because he's surrounded by absolute lawlessness. And over in France, Honoré de Balzac was giving us characters like Vautrin, an old convict who turns into a secret police chief. He completely represents the cynical triumph of a society where having power is literally your only defense against a morality that's been totally destroyed by greed. But honestly, nobody nailed the dark humor and the absolute moral inversion of the time quite like Victor Hugo. He was trying to explain how pure self-interest had completely overrun passion and virtue. And he wrote this amazingly sarcastic, biting prayer. He imagined the supposedly religious men of the era praying like this. "Oh my God, send up the lion's shares. Dear Lord Jesus, see to it that I make a profit of 25% on my Rothschild Neapolitan bonds." It's such a sharp critique, perfectly capturing how the worship of the divine had been entirely replaced by the worship of the dividend. Living through this era must have felt completely suffocating. The great playwright Luigi Pirandello painted such a vivid picture of this inescapable filth. He wrote, "Why, yes, indeed, the skies of Italy in these days were raining down mud, and the mud was sticking everywhere, on the pale, distorted faces of assailed and assailants, on the medals won in the past on fields of battle." It's a powerful image. The corruption was so thick, that even the sacred symbols of national pride, like military medals, felt tainted by financial scandal. Everything felt dirty. And that brings us to this really fascinating cultural idea from the time, the Faustian bargain. In Adalbert von Chamiso's famous story, there's this young man named Peter Schlemihl who literally sells his own shadow to the devil in exchange for a bottomless purse of gold, just so he can enter respectable society. He gets the endless money, and he knows exactly what that money can buy, but he loses his solid substance, his shadow, which is the one thing money can't buy back. This became the defining metaphor for 19th century Europe, right? You had nations and politicians eagerly trading their moral substance, their very shadows, just for the promise of limitless capital. But here is the unavoidable truth. A system built entirely on limitless greed, aggressive expansion, and endemic corruption, it's a massive pressure cooker, and you simply cannot keep the lid on forever. The price for this rapid, unscrupulous expansion was finally about to come due. The shadow that had been looming over Europe was a devastating, unprecedented war. In 1914, this wildly unsustainable web of intertwined capital, statecraft, and corruption finally shattered. World War I wasn't just a traditional military conflict. As historian Mario Silvestri pointed out, it was an irreversible explosion that completely uprooted the existing political and economic equilibriums of the old world forever. So that leaves us with a pretty heavy, provocative question to chew on. If the absolute devastation of the First World War was the explosive price paid for a system where global capital and political corruption became completely indistinguishable, we have to ask ourselves, is our modern world immune to that exact same fate? When we look around at the realities of global finance, corporate lobbying, and international expansion today, did we actually learn the lesson of the 19th century, or are we just busy building a brand new pressure cooker? Take a moment to really reflect on that. Thank you so much for joining me for today's explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.